Okay, we're looking at a archaeological site known as Varna Man. It's famously known for that, for he looks like a kingly type person that was buried here. In fact, with his own burial here within it, even though there are more finds with gold in it around there, his find alone is equal to all the other gold found in the whole world at this time. They'll talk about it here in a minute as we go through the thing, but I want you to notice something here, a few things we'll be able to look at a little bit closer later. But on his forehead, there's a line there and a band, and people have made all kinds of ideas on that, from them opening up his skull at one time and putting it back together, to there actually being a small band, like a circlet of a crown, something like Aragon has in the very end of the Lord of the Rings type of thing, where it wouldn't have been some gaudy crown. You notice around his head, though, there are these medallions that are all around that. There's 10 of them. And then on his arms, there are bands. On his left arms, there are three, and one of them is made out of half silver. The others are gold. And on his right one, there are two that are gold. There are also all these little buttons that are all down here, and we'll get a little bit closer look at them in rings and circlets, and there's little rings and circlets here too, and we'll talk about that more. But if you'll look right here, there's a huge necklace that's also made of gold. That's little pieces and tubes of gold that are put together, and it bends its little corners and everything's quite well. Looks like it would have been one of those ones that wraps around multiple times instead of being just one necklace. For if you took this as one necklace, it would have been 3 foot long and hung down way past his waist. In his left hand, there isn't anything, but it's pressed to his chest. But in his right hand, very much like an Egyptian pose that we see thousands and thousands of years later, you see a staff, a scepter that he has, something like a mace, but the mace head has been done like a pick, like a pickaxe. Something you associate with dwarves and things, if you will, but with miners for certain. In the top left up there, there's a little disc that's carved out, and it has somewhat of a yin-yang type of symbol that goes along with it. He has a gold bracelet over here on this hand too, that's finely woven little ringlets that's all wrapped around. And on his other hand, he has something similar but slightly different. In the very center of his belly, like a belt buckle, he has a big round spot, and each one of these rounder pieces and these medallions and so on have holes that are drawn through, that are punched through them, and it's not looks like a punch. It's almost drilled through them, and it's a little bit thicker around every single one of them too. They're finely made. And so when we look at this and we talk about it here in a minute, as far as it being like, wow, look, here's the first of gold and things as we're about to talk about, it's not reality at all. In fact, you could tell these people were fine working gold already at this time. And it's hammered out into a not as thin as gold leaf, but a very thin form, bubblets and things like that. Even the bracelets that you see are convex and look very much like bracelets that you'd see in bangles today. Also, that staff or scepter is made in segments. It's a segmented staff. It has 7 segments in it, but also in those segments look like little bamboo. That's odd. For the Varna culture we're talking about is right up there above the Caucasus Mountains and the Black Sea region and stuff, where we've talked about dolmens and things like that in the past, and the early heralds of mankind. It kind of connects with Göbekli Tepe and things, and then people through time, but you've got to look at thousands of years as it dictates out and where they went, and who was these Natufians and so on, and where it all goes through. So you start to make connections and cultural connections from way back when. I don't know if you can really tell it in this picture. You should be able to, but he is swathed in that red ochre that actually goes back 35,000 years easily, is drawn in art from these people all over the world where they were able to go. and symbolically is kept all the way through up until a somewhat near modern time. So over here to the right of him, from our point of view, there's also the tip of what seems to be a staff, and it would have been something that looks very conspicuous, for it is a pine cone there on the top of it, type of effigy. Also notice that the pottery that's there in the top right hand corner has that conspicuous tapered shape at the bottom of it. It doesn't have the nipple on it at the bottom necessarily. It would have to be stuck into a point of the ground, which actually keeps the liquid cooler and so on, and would give it a stand-up point. It's flattened off at this point. We can also see that same type of pottery carried through and starting to carry designs. This can only be attributed to the Varna culture, but this same type of pottery can be taken into the bell beaker culture in a variation on a theme, and a corded ware people, and so on. But before we go past this point, we have what we call PPN, or pre-pottery Neolithic. Now, the way it really works out is before writing, everything is a much more of a guesswork and a Sherlock Holmes, Perry Mason kind of figuring everything out. And what they utilize during that time is pottery forms and things like that as a special adaptive helper to let them know what time span and who is who and so on. And actually, before genetics stepped up to the plate, there was really a lot of conjecture and people saying, well, was that them or did they just trade with them, and all these things. And of course, bringing up possibilities that they even traded with them was, oh, that's all impossible and everything. What about this silk pillow here that's 1,000 years old now, more than 1,000 years old now, that they have with these ancient burials way over here in Celtic lands? What has that got to do with Silk Roads and so on? Well, that's not what this is about. Although it looks like this guy would have had a shroud and something like a cape on him, and a lot of this adornment would have gone on his cape and so on, which rotted away a long time ago. Too bad we don't have the fabrics, for fabrics tell us a lot too. So here he is swathed in this red ochre. Let's take a look into this. Varna man, and he is the wealthiest grave of the 5th millennium BC. In the 1970s, archaeologists in Bulgaria stumbled upon a vast Copper Age necropolis from the 5th millennium BC containing the oldest golden artifacts ever discovered near the modern-day city of Varna. Thus, they name it the Varna Culture. But it was not until they reached grave 43 that they realized the real significance of the finding. Inside burial 43, they unearthed the remains of a high-status male burial with unfathomable riches. More gold was found within this one burial than in the entire rest of the world in that period. So it's quite the change here. Now, everybody knows about the Bronze Age. What's weird is a couple of those pieces there seem to be bronze, or seem to be some type of alloy that's given to it. But before there's a Bronze Age, there's the Chalcolithic, which actually is Stone Age and working with copper. That's basically what that means, Chalco and lithic means stone. So they got 43 burials in, and all of a sudden went, wow, here's, whoa. And so what do they have to say about that? For this thing, it's 5000 BC. Well, most people have heard of the great civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley. We've talked about a lot of them, and where it seems to come out of popcorn, and there seems to be a common connective, right? Well, this is one of those special people that was the original sprout and the connective, and they'll allude to it during this. Which are all noted for being the earliest known civilizations to feature urbanization, organized administration, and cultural innovations. but few have heard of the mysterious civilization that emerged in the shores and the lakes of the Black Sea some 7,000 years ago. It really was, up until the finding of Göbekli Tepe, in my mind, in a lot of people's mind, a far-reaching point where you're having to go, and look at it. But all of a sudden, with it going on, that doesn't seem to be the fact at all anymore. And I'm telling you, it goes back much further, and you can see that Göbekli Tepe wasn't like, well, one day they decided to build T-shaped rocks and put all the constellation. No, 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 no. We've discussed that a lot too, but here's a moment in time. The amazing Varna culture. The Varna culture, as it's come to be known, was not a small and inconsequential society that emerged in a little corner of what would become Bulgaria and disappeared quickly into the pages of history. Rather, it was an amazingly advanced civilization, more ancient than the empires of Mesopotamia and Egypt, and the first known culture to craft golden artifacts. And we've talked later about how these same people who sprouted from this and other directions became the Scythians, and their gold works that we've seen, and their fancy works of smelting and iron, and how later they had ended up brought the wheel and horses and other things into play that's part of culture. But if we look back at this point here, what we're fixing to see is one group that sprouted out from that originally, which brought the first half of that in the first place, and got it deviated into a point that whenever you put it all together, became a lot of the things that we have even in modern society today. Although there's a great missing spot, we can fill that in with a little bit of knowledge. Varna is also now home to the largest known prehistoric necropolis in southeastern Europe, which reflects a richness in cultural practices, complex funerary rites, and ancient belief systems, and the capacity to produce exquisite and expertly crafted goods. It has come to be known as the cradle of civilization in Europe, and indeed is attached to the cradle of civilization everywhere, as they'll soon say and allude to. It's another picture of the same burial, just a side view of it, but you get to see more. And all those medallions that are all across here in the middle of them and everything. There's this gold penis sheath, and then here we have an axe blade. It's placed between his legs, and another one that's over here. And then you can see this little tapered piece of gold here, and it gets wider and wider, and then thinner and then thinner. And apparently he had a bow, and that was attached all to this that had gold onto it. You can see that, right? And make it out. We'll get a look at that a little bit later. But that wood artifact is long gone. But here we have some of those bronze type of high copper artifacts, and you can see the other one here, and then there's another little medallion that's there. Oh, and another, I'm guessing, spare scepter head or mace head that's there too. So it's some of the world's oldest golden jewelry, and you can tell that they didn't just make it out of poof. There are all these little shapes and medallions and things like that. And how did they make that? Well, there are a lot of people that thought that they took a stone and they hardened it out and gave that little indention there, and then took the gold and got it into a sheet form by beating it out flat, and then they beat it into that area and took another stone that's about the same shape and had to shape it, and then put it on top of it, and then beat on that stone until it made about the shape of it, and then they had to work it extra to get it smooth. And somebody had to drill holes in it and all these other things. And hold on. You got way past the technological point of they just started doing this. Yeah, and some of those things are buttons, and there's pins and all kinds of things that goes with this. It's an amazing find, especially at this date. The rise of goldsmithing and wealth. Evidence suggests that it was between 4600 and 4200 BC when goldsmithing first started in Varna, as advances were made in craftsmen mastered metallurgy of copper and gold, the inhabitants have now had something extremely valuable to trade. Increased contacts with neighbors in both the north and the south, and further in the east, became eventually opened up to trade relations within the Black Sea and Mediterranean region, which was of great importance for the development of society. The deep bay along which the settlements of Varna provided a comfortable harbor for ships sailing across the Black Sea, and Varna became a prosperous trading center at the time. Of course, now we're looking at much later and what it turns into, but we were looking at something that pretty much heralded that culture in this one grave burial. Increased trading activity allowed the metallurgists to accumulate wealth, and very quickly a societal gap developed between metallurgists at the top, followed by merchants in the middle, and farmers making up the lower class. So it would have been the people that were able to smith, if you will, and the blacksmiths and so on of the day that would have been the most heralded in a civilization where that is a technological bloom to anybody else around them, and the things they could start making and eventually make just out of simple rings. Talk about that in a minute. Increased trading activity allowed the metallurgists to accumulate wealth, and very quickly a societal gap, though, developed with the metallurgists at the top. Merchants and people dealing with everybody else and stuff in the middle, and farmers making up the lower class. Well, you always look at it as like farmers making up the lower class, but that's the meat and bones of everything that makes it happen. For if you don't have that going on preemptive to this, then none of it can happen. It would be hard pressed for it to try to happen. Just like when they try to get you to believe that Göbekli Tepe had nothing to do with agriculture whatsoever, yet they were able to pull off something that they, up until they found this, said could only be done in such way. And then they go, well, I guess the hunter-gatherers were a lot better at it than we thought. And it's like, really? You're going to go with hunter-gatherers, with Cro-Magnon being non-prognostic way back when, and so on. Incredible discoveries made at nearby cemetery also suggest that Varna had powerful rulers or kings, but we'll come back to that, because there's a big missing spot. And so the foundations had been laid for the emergence of a powerful and flourishing culture whose influence permeated the whole of Europe for thousands of years to come. And those Proto-Indo-Europeans influenced other people across the world in waves at different times also, and repeatedly for some. Discovering the Atlantic, or ancient, Varna civilization. The first evidence of Varna's ancient civilization came in the form of tools, vessels, utensils, and figurines made from stone, flint, bone, and clay. Then an incredible chance discovery came to light that made headlines around the world. In October 1972, an excavator operator, Royko Markinov, stumbled upon a vast Copper-Age necropolis containing the oldest gold artifacts ever discovered. It was to become one of the most important archaeological discoveries ever made in Bulgaria. Extensive excavations were launched under the direction of Mihail Lazarov in 72 through 76 and Ivan Ivanov in 72 to 1991, revealing for the first time the magnificent civilization that had lived around the Black Sea and Varna. More than 300 graves were uncovered in the necropolis, and between them over 22,000 exquisite artifacts were recovered, including 3,000 plus items made from gold, with a total weight of 6 kilograms or over 13 pounds. Other precious relics found within the graves included copper, high-quality flint tools, jewelry, shells of Mediterranean mullets, pottery, obsidian blades, and beads. A lot of these things get carried on past this point. I could deviate for a while, but let's just look at some of this stuff. For here we see those little buttons and beads, and you can see there's little bitty holes all in each one, the two to each side, so you would stitch through that and have stitched that onto a robe in some way. And you can see that here on these medallions here, and on this giant breastplate piece that looks a lot like a Celtic one we find later that just had a diamond pattern on it. But then somebody said, well, the diamond pattern's a little messed up, and due to counting the ones around the edge, they go, you know, this coincides with the moon, and the whole thing's a whole year, and this is a calendar. In fact, if you pointed it north, oh wow, I did a video on it, but that's much later, different thing. And so here we see the bamboo stick, mace, scepter that's put with him, but here's another section of it right here, and you can tell that it's solid gold with a little hole run up through it. And so there would have been some type of brass running up through the center of it, making it more rigid, and all in sections of it. Well, you'd think like a column, but then you look at the bamboo and it's very much like that, and there's a weird connective. This symbology of this symbol here, see, that's one thing. Whenever you lose pre-pottery Neolithic and come back before that, all you have is symbols. Ironically, the symbols go back much farther than that, and they start wisping off. But you can see things like we talked about as far as a swastika and things like that, but also this feminine picture right here and a buckle in there, and you go, well, this is a great king, what's that got to do with it? And well, I could go on and on for hours, but look at these bangles that are done with him too, and how they're hollow sculpted internally a little bit, you know, so crafted around there. This is extremely well crafted. Even better than that is this beveled form, trapezoid, and then there's glass beads and faience type with little holes drilled through them and a string run through it all. And we understand that technology, even though that is far beyond what it should be. Gold pins everywhere, little bitty gold earrings, things like that. And over here at the side, if you can barely make it out, is that gold banding that would have gone around a bow. So you can see that. Now let's see if I get off the picture here, and you look at that necklace and that double form necklace that I was talking about. Apparently it's two separate necklaces that go on, and like women wear, my grandma quite often wore, one's up high, one rides down low, and that would have been the effect here. But also it's made out of chain links of solid gold and so on, and then there's that axe head. Some more stuff just out of the picture, but analysis of the graves revealed that the Varna culture had highly structured society. Elite members of the society were buried in shrouds with gold ornaments sewed into the cloth wrappings, and their graves were laden with treasures, including gold ornaments, heavy copper axes, elegant finery, and richly decorated ceramics, while others had simple burials with few grave goods. So they were hopping it up, especially for somebody who was important in society. And this, of course, must have been going on for tens and tens of thousands of years before this, heralding in this situation where these people had become what we're talking about today, and then looking back on the way we look at it and just auto accept the way civilization works, as Caucasians especially. You can see how it probably back then was much more accepted thing than they go, well, were they kind of like this? And it's like, yeah, they were really heavily going that way. The richness of grave 43, though. While there are many elite burials uncovered, there is only one in particular that stood out among the rest, grave 43. Inside grave 43, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a high-status male who appears to have been a ruler or a leader of some kind, perhaps even a king. More gold was found within this burial than in the entire rest of the world during this period. The male who became known as the Varna man was buried with a scepter, a symbol of high rank or spiritual power, and wore a sheath of solid gold over his penis. I looked at it earlier, the penis sheath. But that scepter, too, is carried through places like Egypt, and scepters are still carried by the Queen of England and all of our modern rulers that look like that today. But wouldn't it be funny if you saw Trump try to carry something like that or anything? People would freak out. Well, it's because we've kind of taken it to another level, but really dropped a lot of the whole symbology situation in that. But as I stated before in all of my videos, you can still find it if you just look. It still surrounds us all. Excuse me. The burial is incredibly significant for more than just the grave goods. It is the first known elite male burial in Europe. Prior to this, it was women and children who received the most elaborate burials. Now, there was a matriarchal and especially a grandma-ish type of society in the sacred mother and situation that went on. And of course, now we can see it pivoted so much. A lot of people look at that and they say, well, once it became where there were times of war and things like that, that society had to change. But then again, when we talk about the golden ages, it might have been much more like this. And of course, those ancient Venus statues that we talked about and even made a couple of videos about and referring to Maria Gambitas here, kind of showed that effect. Maria Gambitas, a Lithuanian-American archaeologist who is well known for her claims that Neolithic sites across Europe provided evidence for matriarchal pre-Indo-European societies, suggested that it was the end of the 5th millennium BC when the transition to male dominance began in Europe, or was a blanket across it. Indeed, in the Varna culture, it was observed that around this time, men started to get better posthumous treatment, or they would have better burials. Here's another look at that skull up close, and here you can see those medallions and how they have little holes drilled through them, but if you look at each one, it's poked out around that too. And you can see these little bitty rings and these half clasp rings that are over here, and it doesn't take, but you can clasp these together and together and together, and you can make a sheet of chainmail. Isn't that amazing what could come out of that not too much later than this? But look at that head too, and now it has that groove that's off into it, and what people have said about it. But it looks like there was a crown there, and nobody stole anything from out of the burial, so it probably was something that would have rotted away. And of course, with the skin and things that going and the pressure on that point, it left a ridge upon it. Complex funerary rites in the Varna necropolis. The burials in the Varna necropolis have also offered a lot more than the precious artifacts found within them and discoveries related to social hierarchies. The features of the graves have also provided key insights into the religious beliefs and complex funerary practices in this ancient civilization. Now, I talked about how before this, they were, and through this time here, a lot of times they were taking the dead body and putting it up on a dais and then letting the birds pick away and take it away pretty much. And that leaves us today with this angel symbology that comes through a mythology and things past then through now. But then they would have still been buried in special situations, and of course there's other people that deified them and took their heads and so on like that. Ancestor veneration from a long ago, and looking back generations and saying, man, there was this great man that was like this man that was buried here, and then eventually turning that into a deified situation. Somebody that studied something like Davy Crockett, something like that, could probably realize it, where next thing you know, he could jump the Mississippi and do all of this. But when he showed up at the Alamo, if you've ever watched the movie and stuff, at the very end of that, he goes, oh man, you know, that's just hype. That's whatever. Anyhow, it became apparent to researchers that the males and females were laid out in different positions within the graves. Males were laid out on their backs and looked like that pharaoh position here, while females were still placed in that fetal position. But most surprising of all was the discovery that some graves contained no skeleton at all. These were mock graves. These symbolic graves were the richest in terms of the amount of gold and other treasures found within them. Some of these symbolic graves or cenotaphs also contain human-sized masks made of unbaked clay placed in a position where the head would have been. And a lot of people have made ideals on where, well, was that somebody who was lost someplace and they never got the body, and so they went ahead and had a burial and mocked it up and did everything else? Was that, what was it? When you look at this mask, you can see, even though this is thousands of years before the Sumerians, this big unibrow almost connected that they've got going on, and the phenotype that they put across. It's got holes all in his chin, and of course they say that they would have poked things like horse tail hair and things like that into it and gave it a look of having a beard if they had it. Apparently this one did, but also maybe even loops for earrings and stuff on there. And if they put a cap on it, the topper ones would have been to help to tie that and hold it on there, just like you would tie on to a jug and so on like that. But all those artifacts would have rotted away long ago. But here we can see, and they put him with a smile on his face. Now this death mask thing that we see here, we can also see in the ancient lands of Canaan and in Jericho and the burials that are around there. But instead of just having the eyes carved out like here, they, living around the Mediterranean, took the little shells, crushed them into the eyes, and that looks extremely similar to what we're looking at there. Not much later. In fact, 9000 BC looks like simultaneously. Depending on what date that head actually has on it. The graves containing the clay masks were also found to contain gold amulets in the shape of women, placed in the position where the neck would have been. These amulets would have associated with pregnancy and childbirth, indicate that the burials were meant for females. Further evidence of this is the fact that there were no battle axes found in those cenotaphs, but each of them had a copper pin, a flint knife, and a spindle whorl for making wool and things like that. And it'd be like, well, this is more associated with women. In fact, whenever they find a woman burial and they have those weapons, and then everybody starts associating with the Amazons and so on. So that's another reflective look at, well, there was these women that did this and that. Well, there was these other people who had women who fought too. Yeah, and in certain situations, they're like, well, the men fought, and if you tried to go into their city, the women weren't just going to be like, oh, help me. No, that's not at all. You thought it might go that way, but it ain't going to be nothing fun for you. So here's a look at one of those type of things, and here we see another one of those beveled edge type things. I've seen a whole necklace like that they put back together that in between had little beadlets like type sets. But that almost, to me, it almost looks like a Aladdin's lamp. A little oil lamp or things like that can come out of that. That's not what this is, but could come out of that exact shape. So that's a replica of a symbolic burial of an anthropomorphic face made of clay. The original was found at the Varna Chalcolithic necropolis, grave number 2, and dates to the 4th millennium BC, so 4000 BC. By the end of the 5th millennium BC, the once strong and powerful Varna culture began to disintegrate. It had been hypothesized that the downfall of the Varna civilization was the result of a combination of factors including climate change, which turned large areas of arable land into marshes and swamps, as well as the incursion of horse-riding warriors from the steppes. Well, they seem to be the same people, but the horse riders from the steppes seem to take over that area. But whenever it got really disintegrated or dispersed from that point too, it can't overlap it really well. In fact, when the horse riders came, they went on past this point a little bit. So it wasn't just like, aha, like some people might go with. Golden Varna plate linked to daring sea voyage between Black Sea and Egypt 7,000 years ago. I'm all over it. Although I think I've seen that one where they do the boat and everything and talk about it and how you could make it all the way with a boat. Although the Varna civilization did not leave any direct descendants, the members of this ancient culture did leave behind many lasting legacies and set the stage for the emergencies of subsequent civilizations throughout Europe. Their skills in metallurgy were unprecedented in Europe and indeed throughout the world, and their society demonstrated many features of a highly advanced and developed civilization. Damn, I can't talk all of a sudden. Need a drink. And so you talk about some popcorn people. Well, in comparison, as far as the gold works and things they had going on, and complex structure, burials, things like that are carried through after this point, it gets carried through in everybody. Oh, like a star from this point, everywhere, north, south, east, west, everywhere, gets in with this civilization that seems to be the herald of it, and hooked up with the ancient Aryans and Proto-Indo-Europeans that we talk about much later in another wave. They also developed the societal structure of a centralized authority, a person or institution to monitor and ensure the proper functioning of the society or civilization. All the fundamental principles of modern society had been found, a model of civilization that we still follow to this day. So this is again an elite male burial found at the Varna Copper Age necropolis here. This was just made and updated August 20th of this year, 2020. And so you can see all these gold-laden artifacts. Well, nobody else was really doing this at that time. You know, we find that agriculture was really kicked in by a people also, and this seems to be hooked up with them also, and others around them that were hooked up. But certain people ended up getting hooked up with the horsemen, and other forms of them that had already left long before that happened and waved through weren't really hooked up with horses, were they? Down in the ancient Near East, Middle East. So when we look at these artifacts, it's hard to get somebody to believe that it came from something like that. But we did find some symbolical things like, well, you know that bamboo scepter? Well, we found something at 6000 BC that has ibexes all over it at 6000 BC, and it's over near Jordan. In an ancient stash that was put there with a bunch of other stuff, but not very much gold. That's why they tell you this place is the one that had all the gold going on. They already had copper, and turning that arsenic form, and it had found the other form of making a bronze or a hardened copper that was like bronze to utilize. Just bronze or gold to use as a weapon other than a thumping weapon isn't going to do any good. And why would you waste all that into it whenever you could just put a rock or a mace head or a hammer head on the front of something like that? And again, we're looking at tools, pickaxes, and while it digs real good in the ground, it'll kill somebody. And that's where startings of most weapons came from, was from hunting and also from mining and farming and situations like that. Anyhow, I've been wanting to do this for a little while here, and I'm about a month and a half out, but I'll release this here soon in the mix of it, because I don't have anything around it until I find another story, and I'm not just going to hold on to it. Quite an amazing find here, and the amount of gold that's here, and look, and there's pins and all kinds of things that goes along with it. Now, they didn't find a swastika that's associated with this exact burial, but other ones that are associated with this are, and so on. And so it makes that connection to the early heralds of civilization, and now we're going back much, much further, 7,000 years. Well, we're at Göbekli Tepe at 10,000 years, Catalhoyuk and other areas, and of course Göbekli Tepe is not all alone. We've talked about, well, I've only done a video about 3 of them, but there's 8 sites total that have that T-pillar formation that are up under their own little tells and little mounds. Starts making people wonder, well, what's up under that little mound that looks kind of strange? Well, these people used to make little mounds around each one of their burials too, and Proto-Indo-Europeans and Kurgan burials. And of course that gets carried off into Europe, and we notice that it is famous sites that are there that have that same style, and they're also hooked up to ancient archaeoastronomy. But then again, that predates any of this. Far, far predates any of this, too. We'll get along to another one. Peace.